The players we have not been drafting, but with just days to go to the NFL season, may sprinkle fear into our hearts as we have maybe that feeling in our gut, Shawn, that maybe we were wrong. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through round by round, pick out some names of players that we have been avoiding for one reason or the other, give some of those reasons why we have been avoiding them, and then look into the kind of upside scenario for them, which would make it, detrimental to our fantasy football season not to have them on their roster. Because I think at this stage, Shawn, the listeners know the players we are in on. They probably know the players we're not in on, but maybe some of the reasons why not, and also how that could come back to haunt us. But as we start off today's show, Shawn, I want to do two things. We are planning, if all comes together, to do a guillotine draft over at guillotineleagues.com. And we're going to do myself and Shawn, and then some RotoViz Overtime listeners. We are putting this together in a very quick fashion, though. So I mentioned at the start of today's show, as you're listening to the show, if you're interested, contact me straight away, because we're planning to do this on Wednesday, probably in the 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m. Eastern time range in terms of when it will happen. You would need to have a account on guillotineleagues.com. But if you are interested, email me at overtimeireland@gmail.com or let me know on Twitter at overtimeireland. But let me know ASAP, because we're looking to get this filled as soon as possible and draft right before the season starts in a format, Shawn, which we have talked about on the podcast in previous years. I believe it was 2 years ago now. Griffin, one of our RotoViz OT listeners, reached out to us. We did one along with Ben, and it was so much fun. So when you mentioned this, I was like, let's get in. Let's have some fun. For people who aren't aware, Guillotine League, you cut one player every week, or one team every week, sorry. Then all their players go back into the pool, and you get to pick them up on waivers. So your team technically gets stronger and stronger as the season goes along. So if you are interested, reach out, overtimeireland@gmail.com. Shawn, I know you're excited about that, if we can get it to all pull together here.
Yeah, I mean, this would be the perfect way to welcome in the NFL season, sort of the last community draft. And this one would be a free one as well. So if you've missed out on any of the others, I will have a strategy article up tomorrow in all likelihood, and Colm also some links for people to jump in and participate and all that type of thing. But if you're listening to the podcast, you're going to have an early shot at that sign up. So we are excited for it. As you mentioned, it's the most fun way to play home leagues. Colm, you and I had a blast doing this with Ben. Ben and I drafted a show for Stealing Bananas. Everybody check that out on the Stealing Bananas feed. Colm, we had some fun with it. We timed out a couple of times. We do still like our team, but these leagues are so much fun because you get in there and you can bid on the first, second, third round players of the team that got chopped right there heading into week 2. It's the best bidding environment, the most fun you can have bidding in any fantasy format. So we're looking forward to that. Colm, today.
Well, hold up. I haven't shared this with Shawn yet, but a few weeks ago, Shawn, we had some fun with the soundboard and playing some sound. So I'm going to play a sound. We had a lot of requests coming in for an updated RotoViz OT intro. So I didn't do one last year because the players that were in it were still players we were heavily drafting. We had Jamar Chase, DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs, Jonathan Taylor. But this year, Shawn, we have some new names. So here is the intro.
Stroud to the end zone. Touchdown. What a grab. That's McBride. Garrett Wilson. Wow. Oh, one-hander. CeeDee Lamb. There he goes. Breece Hall to the end zone.
Do we get the Shawn Siegele approval for the players in that?
I love it. We can get some Breece Hall, some Trey McBride, some Garrett Wilson.
Colm, the one part I left out, Shawn, in that I had to cut just because you don't want the intro to be like 3 minutes long. But the clip that I got, that Breece Hall to the end zone, it was against the Denver Broncos, and it says in it, he's got a Hall pass to the end zone, which I think is like comically, I couldn't decide if it feels like something I would say on the podcast, which would be like pretty terribly not funny. But yeah, some of the commentary puns when you go through like highlight clips to try and figure out which is the best to use, yeah, some of the announcements pretty poor. But if you want to get yourself fired up, Shawn, go and watch yourself like a 20-minute Brees Hall 2023 highlight reel. Gets you pretty hyped.
Yeah, the only part of the intro that I'm scared of is that maybe our two favorite first-round picks are both on the New York Jets, and they both rely on your boy, Aaron Rodgers.
That is potentially concerning. We'll know a lot more of how Aaron Rodgers is going to look, obviously, after week one. We'll have those fears will be completely eased, and we'll know that he's healthy and still has some left in his, I guess, body in terms of the arm, the legs, all those things. So we will see what happens there. I also did have an enjoyment of putting it together, Shawn, because it was a CJ Stroud touchdown to Tank Dell. I did remove the Dell part, and now it's going to Trey McBride. So that would just be, we can fast forward to the Pro Bowl maybe for that one. But we are looking here at the players that we haven't drafted. So we're going to jump into round one, and I'm going to let Shawn kick off, because I do think across round one, we're probably pretty diversified based on draft slot, outside of, I would guess, some of the running back names that are going at the back end. I'm looking at, Shawn, which ADP are you looking at? I'm looking at the FFPC. Are you looking at Underdog or the FFPC so we get synced here?
Well, we have the FFPC Fantasy Pros contest, the best way to win $1 million over this last week. Get in there, play some Fantasy Pros. We have the strategy sessions up from the Stealing Bananas Draft Marathon. Colm, look at the last couple of days there. And one of the cool things here is that you can select for just the last couple of days. I've seen 186 teams.
Yeah.
When we focus on 8/29 through today. So you've got a great sample of what the high stakes drafters are doing in their most important draft when they have all of the information. Going at 109 is A.J. Brown. He's the only player who is not listed as a target in the first round for me. And frankly, that's not good, right? A.J. Brown, absolutely fantastic. You pull up the Stealing Signals tool on the site, which uses Sports Info Solutions data, and he's one of only a handful of players with a 30% target per route run last year, over 9 yards per target. Colm, he has an ADOT above 12, so you're getting some good target depth. All of the players who are ahead of him in that stat, and it's a who's who of the best players in football. Tyreek Hill, Davante Adams, Keenan Allen. I guess Keenan Allen no longer counts. He went to a different team and can't play anymore. But CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, more air yards for A.J. Brown than for any of those players. Despite playing with a hybrid QB, you have some really large numbers there for A.J. Brown. So we think through why he would be someone to avoid, and it starts to get pretty thin when you're concerned about Saquon Barkley, somebody else that we are fading, when you're concerned about Jalen Hurts and how poorly he played over the second half of last season, when you're concerned about how good Devontae Smith is, that there's not a huge gap necessarily in terms of what those two receivers could do if the offense were run correctly. One of the issues that Philadelphia had when they collapsed down the stretch last year was a lack of creativity, forcing the ball to A.J. Brown in situations when he was not open. You have a lot of these double teams with the sideline where A.J. Brown is trying to defeat essentially 3 defenders when you include the boundary as well. Colm, this is a guy who over the first 9 weeks of last season averaged almost 23 points per game. Over the back half, he falls to only 11 points per game. One of the things that we know, the back half is going to be a little bit more predictive, but the full season is certainly much more predictive than just taking that back half and saying, oh, A.J. Brown can't play anymore. That's not the thesis. The thesis is simply that there are some volume issues. There are some target competition issues, especially if the team incorporates Dallas Goedert the way they've been discussing, especially if the running backs are included in the passing game a little bit more. Now, with Jalen Hurts at the helm, that part, again, is a little bit thin. It seems somewhat unlikely that you're suddenly going to have the Eagles using the backs. But we have a new offensive coordinator. We could get a little bit more balance a lot of risks, but when you look at the profile for A.J. Brown over the full season last year, even when he had a catastrophic second half, and you think about the talent that this man brings, maybe the most physically dominant receiver in all of football, I mean, I'm scared that he's going to have a huge season, and we should have had more exposure to him in the first round.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's hard to look through it and have CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Garrett Wilson, and have pretty even exposure to all of those names, and then to have pretty much zero AJ Brown, which then, if that does not work out as the season goes along, will be a big concern to those fantasy football rosters. Agree with all the stuff you said. Jonathan Taylor is somebody, Shawn, that I have pulled up here, my FFPC exposure, where I've done a lot of my drafting over the last 6 weeks, and I have 0 shares of Jonathan Taylor across any FFPC draft. And that's another player in round one that, could come in to be a concern. I haven't drafted a lot of Colts in general, some Anthony Richardson in there, some of the later wide receivers, but not much across the board. So the Colts could be something that I'm just completely wrong on. I've mentioned this on some other shows in terms of my drafting, a lot of week 14 teams, and then obviously that makes it a little bit tricky with the Colts as well. But what I did look up, Shawn, as we move into round 2, somebody that I have not drafted at all is Saquon Barkley, but he's not the one I'm going to nominate here. So you mentioned some of the stuff with the Eagles. Barkley could go in there, and everything that wasn't DeAndre Swift's at the goal line, maybe Barkley pushes them over the line and he has a big season. But Marvin Harrison, Shawn, somebody that I don't have any shares of on the FFPC platform, which, as I type that in when we're looking through this, slightly concerning in terms of somebody who could be one of the true rookie sensations. I know last year we had somebody in Puka Nacua broke most of the records, but I have a lot of exposure to Xavier Worthy, frankly astonishing exposure at almost 60%. Malik Neighbors is one of my other highest drafted wide receivers in the 30% range. So Harrison has been somebody who, at the FFPC website, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, both going in that same range, Dalton Kincaid as well. It has made it a little bit hard for me to squeeze him onto some of those rosters with the names that I'm drafting ahead of him. Those two are of concern to me. That is Harrison mainly, though, over the Barkley conversation. But Marvin Harrison, Shawn, I think that I'm too low there. And if he's the rookie that has the amazing season this year, it's gonna be tricky for some of these rosters to recover. I guess I'm fully on the Trey McBride side of that Arizona Cardinals bet.
I think that is one to be concerned about because there's the potential for him to simply be so good. I have a different angle on that, which is that if you look at weeks 1 through 17, so you give them all more equal footing, the greatest rookie seasons this century, you have Jamar Chase with 302 fantasy points, Odell Beckham 297, Anquan Bolden 288, Puka 284, Justin Jefferson 274. The comp that I've used a lot for Puka is Anquan Bolden. That is in no way, shape, or form a criticism. Anquan Bolden was a Hall of Fame type of player. He was the one who didn't have the big secondary season, in part because of injuries, but you do have a little bit of an element there as well, where you look at what he does going forward as a fantasy asset, and he has to compete with Larry Fitzgerald. That it doesn't necessarily make it difficult from a floor perspective. It makes it a little bit tricky from a ceiling perspective. I think when we're looking at what Jamar Chase did when he falls off a little bit, and you contrast that with Odell Beckham and Justin Jefferson, both of whom go over 300 points in year 2, there are a lot of scenarios in which Puka is around the 300-point total. And I think in that case, not having more Puka is going to be a big problem. I think when we're trying to figure out how you navigate those early picks, and with just how expensive Puka has been, the combination of the injury with how dynamic Cooper Kupp has been. I mean, Kupp introduces an element that Justin Jefferson, Odell Beckham didn't have to deal with. And when you're talking about the greatest individual seasons of all time, I mean, Kupp is not that far removed from it. I think you've got to look at what the reporting is. And if Cup were reporting a little bit more in the Keenan Allen range, you'd be like, okay, well, Puka looks pretty good at about 109. As it is, he probably looks pretty good around 203, 204. I wish that I had more without having to give up players like Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, other interesting names in that range. But I'm certainly scared that he is going to be the round 2 guy who puts a big dent in our plans. Most of the rest of the players in that range, again, fairly balanced on. And a guy like Derrick Henry, who I think is a good pick, but also someone I don't have a lot of. I'm not concerned that he will kill us even with a good season because of what his scoring profile is and because of how the different positions interact. Jumping then into round 3 column, I don't know that I'm that nervous about anyone in this range. I do have Davante Adams ranked a little bit lower. There's a scenario in which Bauer's foot gives him trouble. He doesn't draw the targets we're expecting. The offense is a little better than we're expecting. Davante Adams, and it's a similar type of play with A.J. Brown, with the exception of the fact that the quarterback play will probably not be good. And Davante Adams at this point is almost certainly no longer A.J. Brown. Nervous about Davante Adams at all?
Some concerns, and he's a player that, I've mentioned this for years on the podcast. Probably my favorite wide receiver ever to watch, based on he was a Packer for a long time. I think he's a future Hall of Famer, has consistently been for years one of the at least top 2 wide receivers in the NFL, probably now sliding down that a little bit, but I think on skill level is probably still up there with the very best. I have very little. I have none on the FFPC, some on Underdog of Davante Adams. So I would be concerned of if he has one of those 10 touchdowns, 1,000-yard seasons, which I don't think is completely out of, there's players that are going in drafts at certain points, and I think that's not in the range of outcomes. I still think that could be there for Adams, mainly through sheer volume. But if you get him with the targets in the red zone, he's one of the best red zone touchdown receivers of all time. So I have concerns there, Shawn. The player I thought you were going to say you weren't very concerned about going in this range that I have 0 off is Josh Jacobs. He's also going in that range. You could see him having, that Jamal Williams, rushing touchdown season from a couple of seasons ago, where he, breaks some of Barry Sanders' records in the running for it. Where I think that just through some good fortune, we could see him getting into the end zone a lot, but not overly concerned. This is a round where it's Olave, Neighbors, Collins, Debo, Waddle, Kyle Pitts. So there's a lot of players here I like. I'm not overly concerned about missing out on some of the running back profiles that are going in that particular range. When we move in, Shawn, to round 4, a lot of players in here that I just haven't drafted. I mentioned the Colts, 0 Michael Pittman, 0 Rashad White, 0 James Cook, and then 0 Mike Evans. A little bit of DK Metcalf, but looking through this, the player that I'm probably most concerned by, and it would be a positive for some other rosters, is Rashad White, based on the volume of Xavier Worthy that I have drafted. But the player that, generally comes back each season to, hit me with a little bit of a knock is Mike Evans, as he continues to play at a high scoring level forever. Nothing that I'm hugely concerned about here, but I could see Mike Evans having another one of those years, and I haven't drafted him at all.
Yeah, I think I'm with you in that there are names in this round that I'm not drafting. I'm just also not scared of those guys. The player I think who could be a little bit of a problem is actually at a position that we tend not to worry about, which is that my concern here would be the Josh Allen completely gaps the field at the quarterback position. You look at what he's done, and this isn't news to anybody, but over the last 4 seasons, QB1, QB1, QB2, and QB1, you look at his career, 8 rushing touchdowns, 9, 8, 6, 7, and last year 15. One of the reasons that
15, that's insanity.
Yeah. One of the reasons that you're not that concerned that he will continue to separate, or that he would extend the separation, is that the 15 rushing touchdowns are, bordering on the edge of absurdity. There, something in the 8-9 range is more likely. And in the 3 previous seasons, he'd been at 37, 36, and 35 in passing touchdowns. That dropped. The interceptions rose, and they got rid of their receivers. You put those things together and you lean into a more run-based offense. And that's the reason why I think from an evidence and logic-based perspective, you work through the projections, you work through the scenarios, you think about the other guys who are available, and you say, we can't burn such a high power value pick on this guy. And at the same time, when you're passing him consistently, you're scared, because unlike the other players that we're not drafting in that range, I mean, Josh Allen could score so many points that almost all of his managers are into that final 4. You know, maybe they're a little bit covered in some ways in the race for the $1 million, but it could be rough if there's one player who manages to push almost all of his teams forward.
Yeah, I'm going to pair these next 2 rounds together, round 5 and 6, and I'll shout out the names, but there's a lot of names in here, Shawn. The reason I'm going to say this is because, you know, I mentioned Xavier Worthy. So he's basically the click in round 6 every single draft. So DeAndre Swift, Deontay Johnson, some Deontay Johnson sprinkled in there. No David Montgomery at all. No Christian Kirk. Some David Njoku. No Calvin Ridley. Very little Aaron Jones, but some in there. And then Xavier Worthy. No Chris Godwin on these rosters. No George Pickens. Brock Bowers, James Conner being drafted across my rosters. And then round 5 is Alvin Kamara, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, but like T. Higgins, Stephon Diggs, Zay Flowers, Tank Dell, all priority targets. So they're being drafted. So that's leading to no Alvin Kamara, no Joe Mixon, no Jake Ferguson, some Lamar Jackson, no Amari Cooper, very little Terry McLaurin. So I guess what I've done in those 2 rounds, Shawn, is I'm very, very concentrated. So the key is, if I'm wrong on the players that I've drafted, well, that's a major hole across all those draft boards. But looking through the names there, is there anyone that gives you legitimate concern that you're not drafting? I feel like there's players there like that they may hit to a higher extent than the players I'm drafting. But I think when you pair the names together and say, would I draft X versus Y? I think the players that I'm drafting, like, I'm very comfortable in that bet that I've pretty much put on in terms of going for the higher talented younger players.
Well, I think that
higher upside rather than higher talent, I suppose. Some people mightn't agree with that.
I think the way things are shaping up for Alvin Kamara, the receiving workload with the potential for the offense to be better, for him not to really have any competition other than Taysom Hill to get some rushing touchdowns. Even though the peripherals for Kamara were terrible last year as a runner, and people talk all the time about, oh, Dalvin Cook is washed up. It's like, I mean, is he more washed than Saquon Barkley and Alvin Kamara and Josh Jacobs and Ezekiel Elliott? Go look at the actual numbers, right? But it's setting up, as you mentioned, for Josh Jacobs the perfect season, also setting up Kamara the perfect, storm to bury people in the first half, even if he doesn't end up being that tournament winner. I'm also concerned that, not concerned, but I think there's a very real scenario, even though we haven't been drafting Jake Ferguson, that the gap between Ferguson and Bowers is about the same as the gap between Dak Prescott and Gardner Minshew. So if you look at that from the 2 different directions, having Ferguson have some more blow-up games like he had in last year's playoffs, I think that you could get that. The other one I would just mention, again, would be the quarterback here, where I think Lamar Jackson, last season, he bounces back in part because he plays more games than he has for a long, long time. But he gets up there, throws for 3,600 passing yards, has over 800 rushing yards. Now, on a per-game basis, some of those numbers are a little bit down, especially in terms of the rushing yards over the past. But you think back to the 2019 season where he throws for 36 touchdowns and rushes for 1,200 yards. A monster season from Lamar Jackson is certainly potentially in the cards. I think that Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are the 2 scariest quarterbacks if you are not on that elite group. Colm, what are you seeing here in rounds 7 and 8?
Yeah, I think we'll probably, because we get into a wider net in terms of the players, so we might even go into some 3-round splits. But you mentioned players who could like break things that I haven't been, and I mean like break the game in terms of fantasy football. Like Anthony Richardson is not a lot on outside of the Superflex contest, and even in that, it's very limited. A couple of shares. So he is somebody I feel like I fear a little bit, like that Lamar Jackson side of things. The way the season started last year, he was off to a very hot start, even with missing some time and missing some parts of games, and unfortunately then missed the rest of the season after picking up that injury. So he scares me quite a bit. I haven't drafted any Zamir White, any Najee Harris, any Jerome Ford. When we look through the rest of it, then I think it's balanced enough. No Dallas Goedert on my roster so far. And when I look through the rest of it, Shawn, I feel like, it is in this 7 through 9 range. Anthony Richardson is the one that scares me a little bit. The other part I could look at it is like, obviously, in the Steelers backfield, I have gone completely to the Warren side of that. I guess the other fear would be if you're completely wrong. Like if Najee Harris is a big season, that's going to be detrimental to what has actually happened for Warren, whether that's that he missed time, whether he didn't perform. So I guess I would be afraid of him having a blow-up season, because that would lead to Warren, the bet on Warren probably being quite negative in terms of outcomes. Is there anybody in the 7 through 9 range, if it's a different name, or is there...
Well, Najee Harris led the NFL in broken tackles last year, so there is reason to be
concerned. Yeah,
that one. Tony Pollard, for a very similar reason, is someone that I would be concerned about, in part because I don't have Pollard, but also because it would mean, like you were saying, that our preferred back in Tyjae Spears has not done what we needed. So that's
and the other killer
punch that gets you both ways.
Yeah, and the killer about that is, they're going within. We have Najee Harris running back 25, Warren running back 29, and then Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears running back 27, running back 34. Like, they're close enough where you could easily, if you wanted, balance those shares out, or you could have went in the opposite direction, and your season, one way or the other, would look drastically different. One of the things that I tend to do, but I've done more so this season than I think any other season, is go for the players. It's either going to be like a great season, Shawn, or it's not going to be a good season, and we're going for the top prizes, and I'm quite concentrated across the board. So that is kind of the outlook there, is that it's a bet that you're going on one side of that backfield and trying to get a running back that should be going in round, let's say 4, in terms of where they're going at that point. Moving on.
Colm, the thing that you mentioned there that's important, I think, is that the gap in price is not that large. And so when you are working through that, most of the bets that we make when we're talking about moving into the 0 RB range, you have a demonstrably better backup than the starter, and you have a price gap. In this case here, the starters have some interesting things about their profile. I mean, Tony Pollard was very interesting until just last season when he struggled as the starter. Now, the reason that we're still on the backups, or the kind of 1B, in which it looks like should be very balanced committees, is that their peripherals, their profile. I think everyone knows that Jaylen Warren had the best peripherals in the NFL last year. Tyjae Spears was the name who jumped out in both of Blair Andrews' pieces on running back breakouts in terms of how you find those guys, right? It's not just a little bit of, he was pretty decent, we want to have some of that. I mean, Spears looks like he should be the next star, but in a case here where the ADP and what the team is kind of hinting to you, gives you some pause. Yeah, very scared of those, even though wouldn't go back and do it in a different way.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was saying about the bet. I feel comfortable on a lot of these. Some of the ones that I don't feel comfortable on is maybe the overexposures to the players that I've drafted, maybe. But in general, outside of the first and second round, I'm very comfortable in my reasoning for going in the direction that I have. If we look then, Shawn, at rounds kind of 9 through 11, some of the running backs here, based on it being in the 0 RB zone, but Gus Edwards, I haven't drafted any drafts that I have Rico Dowdle on, has been, something that has been pushed by a co-manager. I've completely faded Zach Moss for Chase Brown, so I have no Zach Moss on these rosters. And then again, no DeAndre Hopkins. Looking through the rest of them, I guess they're the main majority of them here. Part of my concern in this range is I have drafted a lot of Nick Chubb and I have drafted a lot of TJ Hawkinson, and obviously they're missing that opening portion of the season. We've talked on a few shows recently about, the difficulty of having zeros in your rosters throughout the season, and Chubb and Hawkinson are obviously those for a number of weeks moving forward. So that would be a concern that, that could have been draft capital spent in a better way, but that's more of a long full season play in terms of how that works out. But my concern here would be, say Gus Edwards leads the way completely and that backfield, or Rico Dowdle is the Cowboys' clear running back one, or Zach Moss is the running back one clearly for the Cincinnati Bengals. Then my season again has gone in the opposite direction. I don't really feel like, Hopkins is going to be like the wide receiver 3 or something like that that's going to completely derail my season. The other wide receivers here, the likes of Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, Jacoby Myers, I don't think they're going to completely derail your season. But those running backs, if they are the lead backs on those rosters, could, really be pivotal in those rounds if that's the case. My feeling is that won't be the case, but obviously understanding how football works, Shawn, we could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, these are the things that you're scared of. I think those are great points. The Gus Edwards one is terrifying if the team ignores how much better the other members of the committee are. And maybe they won't be, right? I mean, that's probably the worst of the fears, is that maybe he will actually be the best of those players. I'm not concerned about Rico because they haven't made a bet on the opposite side of that. And so he would have to earn a massive share for that to be problematic. Trey Benson.
That would be more that he should be like, if he performs the level of, say, a 4th or 3rd round running back versus what we.
Yeah, but I mean, he would have to have a massive workload
exactly.
to do that. And so, I mean, you're talking about the only fear there would be that the other guys just don't play at all. Because if they don't play at all, then that would be a problem. Trey Benson could be an issue if he blows up. We don't have a lot, and we have, not huge investment in James Conner. He's a dead zone back. He's an older back. But Conner, the other guy there was, say, like a Jalen Warren with the best running peripherals in all of football last year. So if you get the rookie who supposedly, according to people watching camp, was not particularly good, if he blows up, that would be a problem. But I'm going to go with Romeo Doubs, who is somebody that we have liked, someone that I still like, someone who is poised to run a bunch of routes. If he is better at drawing targets and is also a little more dynamic after the catch. I mean, with Doubs, really what you need for him to cause a huge concern for Jaden Reed is that he needs to both draw more targets and then he needs to do more with them. So you need both parts of it. But I mean, Doubs is somebody that they really like. He's someone who has been able to hold off what appear to be superior options. I would be concerned that he is so heavily involved with the Green Bay Packers that it does close off the paths to a huge season for Reed, and it closes off that sleeper season for Wicks. Two things that the evidence would suggest is a really good fantasy bet to make. If Doubs has a huge season, that will be wrong.
Yeah, like Doubs is, he's just turned 24, heading into his 3rd season in the league. He had 8 touchdowns last year, Shawn. He is somebody that Jordan Love certainly likes to look to in the end zone. And looking back at last season, there was obviously optimism after his rookie season that maybe he would take a big leap, and then Christian Watson was out. But he did have 59 receptions for 674 yards along with those 8 touchdowns. So the Packers wide receivers, I think, are all going to be pretty good. It just depends who takes the chunk out. The other part is if he's getting, those touchdowns, that's taken away from the upside of those other names. So out of them, the one thing about Doubs, I have a lot of Doubs in Dynasty, so maybe that'll balance out across the board. But when we're looking at the best ball portfolios, not as much as maybe Shawn's point there would have me think about. The other part with him, Dontavian Wicks goes one round later. They're all quite concise in terms of where they're going on the draft board. So the Packers wide receivers will be a bit like those running back picks that we said that you could have went in different directions and it could have balanced out very differently. Shawn, I'm going to open up the floor here to you for the entire rest of the draft because, there'll be more of a diversification maybe in these later rounds. Is there any players, though, that stand out to you in those double-digit rounds that you're overly concerned that you haven't drafted much of? I haven't any names. I'm looking through the board here, and any of the names that I'm looking at, I feel like, yeah, that might be okay, but I kind of have been drafting the players that I really like in those back halves of the draft. I haven't drafted as much of Andre Iosivas as I've kind of wanted to draft. Again, I think there's a pathway that makes it a little bit tricky. I'm going to say this, Shawn, a player that I haven't drafted very much in best ball this year. And I had a discussion today with Tom Strachan as I tried to force him to draft this player, and I couldn't get it to happen. Quinten Johnson is a player that I haven't much of in best ball this year. Entering his second season, a lot of these rookie wide receivers are older than he is at this current point in time. The sounds aren't good. The outlook isn't particularly good. But this is somebody who was drafted very early in the draft last year. Very athletic. I think that Quinten Johnson could be a wide receiver that I really regret not having drafted in terms of the blow-up potential that he has when he's going in like the 17th round.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it too. It's not just being concerned that you're wrong, but concerned that you're right and didn't draft enough. I don't think that I have a player like that because I've taken a ton of Jalen McMillan in the last week. I think maybe the other two, minor points here.
I know you've probably drafted him a lot in the last week too, and I've started drafting him since he latched on with the Chiefs, but I had such a bet on the two Broncos wide receivers all offseason. I think that we could be left feeling like anything less than 100% Samaje Perine isn't enough Samaje Perine.
Well, that's certainly the case. But again, the Samaje Perine shares in the last week have been very, very aggressive. I'll be disappointed if Ty Chandler takes a big chunk out of Aaron Jones. That probably doesn't hurt me too much either way. Ray Davis is someone that we liked during the draft process, but has been very quiet. If he blows up and we don't have much exposure, that would be a little bit disappointing. I think that you have to look at all of these players in this sort of Bills, Chargers, arguably even Jaguars group where their individual profiles are not strong enough to draft at their prices. There's more competition just from each other than their prices would indicate. But there's probably going to be a winner when you take all of those teams and all of those guys together. Whoever that winner is going to hurt us some. So that would be my final global pick from the second half of 2024 fantasy drafts.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason the fear is less in the later rounds is, and I'm saying this, and we look back to last year, and it happened with multiple players, particularly on the Rams, but the likelihood that you miss on them and you look back at it as a process pick could be, I think it feels at this point of the season that it could be less, but when it comes to looking back at the end, maybe it will lead to more pain throughout the season. But I think those players in the early rounds, obviously the high leverage rounds, are of more concern, particularly when you bet completely against some of those names. And a bit like I mentioned, Shawn, with the Quinten Johnson one, it's not exactly the same, but like the Marvin Harrison one isn't against his talent. I think he's going to be an amazing NFL player. It's more so just against how those rosters are being constructed and how you have players ranked in that second round. But that was a fun topic to go through. Hopefully people have enjoyed that conversation as we look at some of the players that we haven't drafted that could affect this season for us. Let me know if you are drafting them. Let me know if you aren't. But the other thing I need you to let me know is if you want to draft with myself and Shawn in one of those Guillotine leagues, free league over on guillotineleagues.com. You will need to have an account over there if you want to draft, but reach out to me on overtimeireland@gmail.com or at overtimeireland and let me know ASAP. The planned draft time is Wednesday around 5 or 5:30 p.m. Eastern. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at overtimeireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.